The forest always felt like an escape. Until it wasn't, the trail began like any other. A simple wooden sign marked the entrance, the path winding gently through towering pines. The air was cool, the scent of damp earth calming. I welcomed the solitude, the rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt. At first, everything was normal. Birds chirped in the distance, and a breeze rustled the leaves, but as I moved deeper, the forest grew quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of life vanished. No birds, no insects, just the faint echo of my footsteps. I stopped and listened. The silence pressed against my ears, heavy and unnatural. I took another step, then another, each one louder than the last. My breathing quickened as the silence deepened. The air felt thicker, as if the forest were holding its breath, and then I noticed. The trees, their trunks were warped, their bark twisted into grotesque shapes. It wasn't just age or nature. They seemed deliberately contorted, like something had forced them to grow that way. I tried to shake the unease. "It's just trees," I muttered, forcing a laugh. But the forest felt different now, as if it were watching me. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was alive. I pressed on, hoping the feeling would pass, but it didn't. The trail narrowed, the familiar markers disappearing. My pulse quickened as I realized I couldn't recognize anything around me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The forest stretched endlessly behind me, shadows deepening between the trees. I turned back and nearly stumbled over something buried in the leaves. It was a backpack, old and weathered, its fabric torn. My hands trembled as I knelt and unzipped it. Inside were damp clothes, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a small notebook. I flipped through its pages. The handwriting was frantic, barely legible. Most of it was gibberish, but one phrase repeated over and over. "It's watching." My chest tightened. I turned to the last page, where a final message was scrawled in jagged letters. "If you find this, leave now. The silence isn't empty. The silence isn't empty." I dropped the notebook, heart racing. The forest seemed darker. Now, the shadows thicker. I took a deep breath and tried to retrace my steps, but the trail was gone. Panic set in. The trees loomed taller, their twisted forms closing in around me. The air grew colder, the silence oppressive. I forced myself to move, each step more difficult than the last. Then I heard it, footsteps. They were faint, distant, but unmistakable. Crunching leaves, snapping twigs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, steady and deliberate. I turned slowly, expecting to see someone behind me, but the trail was empty. "Hello?" My voice barely rose above a whisper, swallowed immediately by the silence. The footsteps stopped. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I scanned the forest, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I took a cautious step forward, then another. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Suddenly, the footsteps resumed. Closer now, I broke into a run, my heart pounding as I tore through the underbrush. Branches whipped against my face, and roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare stop. The footsteps followed, matching my pace, always just out of sight. Something was following me, and it didn't need to be seen. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I saw them. Shadows moved between the trees, flickering unnaturally. They weren't cast by the sun or the moon. They had their own source, shifting and twisting like they were alive. A whisper cut through the silence, soft and chilling. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, eyes wide, but the clearing was empty. No one was there, just the trees, the shadows, and the oppressive silence. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Leave." My legs refused to move. The shadows stretched toward me, creeping along the ground like black tendrils. Desperation surged through me, and I forced myself to run. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as I pushed forward. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed. Then the footsteps stopped. I skidded to a halt, my body trembling. Slowly I looked down. My footprints were gone. The trail beneath me was smooth. Undisturbed, as if I had never been there, the forest was erasing me, Panic surged through me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The silence pressed in heavier than ever, and then I heard it, my own voice. "You won't leave." The words echoed around me, cold and emotionless. The shadows closed in, their forms shifting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. The forest seemed to pulse, the air growing colder, my vision blurred, the world around me dissolving into darkness. In my final moments, I realized the truth. The silence wasn't just alive. It had been waiting for me. The silence returned, but this time I knew it wasn't empty. The rain started without warning. The sky had been clear all morning, the trail dry beneath my boots. But now dark clouds churned above and the air turned cold. A sharp wind howled through the trees, carrying the first stinging drops of rain. Within minutes, the storm was upon me. Rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the dirt trail into slick mud. My jacket did little to keep the water out, and the cold bit deep into my skin. I squinted through the downpour, searching for shelter, but the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. Then I saw it. A cabin stood alone in a small clearing, its dark wood blending into the storm. The roof sagged slightly, and one of the windows was cracked, but it was intact. No smoke rose from the chimney, and no lights shone. From within, its door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind like an invitation. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing. Something about the cabin felt wrong. It wasn't marked on any map I'd studied, and I couldn't remember any mention of it in trail guides. But the storm showed no signs of letting up, and the forest offered no other refuge. Steeling myself, I crossed the clearing and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under my weight, the sound swallowed by the storm. I pushed the door open, and it groaned loudly, echoing through the cabin's interior. The air inside was heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent. The dim light of the storm barely reached the room's corners, leaving them shrouded in darkness. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A single wooden table with a chair sat in the center of the room. Against the far wall was a narrow bed, the sheets rumpled as though someone had just risen from it. In the corner, an old wood-burning stove stood cold and unused, its surface streaked with rust, and on the table a cup of tea. Steam rose lazily from its surface. Someone had been here moments ago. My heart pounded as I scanned the room again. No sound of footsteps, no sign of anyone leaving. Yet the tea was fresh. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe they had stepped out into the storm and would be back any second. But as I stood there, the silence within the cabin grew heavier, more oppressive. I walked cautiously to the bed. The impression of a body was still visible on the mattress, as though someone had been lying there recently. My fingers brushed the sheets. They were damp, cold. Then my eyes drifted downward, and I saw it. Scratched into the wooden floorboards beneath the bed were two words: "Help me." The letters were rough, jagged, carved in desperation. I stumbled back, the floorboards creaking beneath my boots. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, dark tendrils creeping toward the center of the room. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger, sharper. I turned to the door, my hand reaching for the handle, but before I could grip it, the sound of wood shifting behind me stopped me cold. The chair at the table had moved. It now faced the bed, as though someone had been sitting there, watching. A chill ran down my spine. My breath quickened as I turned back to the door, gripping the handle with trembling hands. I yanked hard, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as though something on the other side was holding it shut. "Let me out," I shouted, pounding on the wood. My voice echoed, swallowed by the cabin's silence. Then came the tapping. It was soft at first, a rhythmic sound against the window. I froze, my eyes snapping to the cracked pane of glass. Through the rain, I could barely make out a shape. A figure standing just beyond the clearing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Slowly, the figure leaned forward, its hand pressing against the glass. Its face was obscured by the storm, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. The tapping stopped. The figure raised its other hand, and with one slow, deliberate motion, it dragged a finger down the glass, leaving a long, jagged streak. Then the window shattered. Whatever was outside was coming in. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. In my chest, the cold wind howled through the broken window, carrying with it a faint whisper, "Leave." The word was soft, almost pleading, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I grabbed a rusted metal rod from beside the stove, holding it out in front of me like a weapon. The shadows in the room shifted again, coiling and writhing. The whispering grew louder, filling the cabin with a chorus of overlapping voices. They spoke in unison, their words incomprehensible but filled with urgency. The door flew open behind me, slamming against the wall with a force that rattled the entire structure. Rain poured in, soaking the floor. I turned to run, but the figure was there, standing in the doorway. It was closer now, its form more defined. Its face was a void, a blank canvas of darkness, but its presence was overwhelming. The voices in the cabin fell silent. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice low and hollow. I bolted past it, leaping into the storm. The rain hit me like ice, but I didn't care. I ran, my boots slipping on the muddy trail. The forest around me twisted and shifted, the trees bending in impossible ways. No matter how far I ran, the cabin was always there. Every time I glanced back, I saw it in the distance, its windows glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. The door was open, waiting. Finally, I collapsed beneath a massive tree, my chest heaving. I dared to look up, praying the cabin was gone, but it wasn't. It stood just beyond the next clearing, closer now. The light from its windows pulsed like a heartbeat, and from within the open door, a voice whispered, "Welcome back. The cabin wasn't a refuge, it was a trap." The hike wasn't supposed to be dangerous. Jake had sent the invite to our group chat, "Who's up for Devil's Ridge?" Tough trail, but the view's worth it. He attached a photo of the mountain, its jagged peak cutting into a dark, stormy sky. Devil's Ridge had a reputation. People didn't just get lost there. They vanished. The few who returned came back hollow-eyed, unable to remember what had happened. Stories of whispers, shadowy figures, and a place where time unraveled. But Jake laughed off the rumors. "It's just a mountain," he said. 5 of us set out, Jake, Lauren, Chris, Ben, and me. The trail was steep but beautiful. The morning sun filtered through the pines, and the air was crisp. We joked, snapped photos, and climbed higher, the forest stretching endlessly around us. After a few hours, the mood shifted. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest faded. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the crunch of our boots on gravel. Jake checked his phone. "Double quotes .no signal," he muttered. Chris pulled out a compass, frowning as the needle spun aimlessly. "That's weird," he said, shaking it. We pressed on, but unease crept in. The trail felt longer than it should, winding in ways that didn't make sense. Time seemed to stretch, the minutes dragging like hours. Then, as we neared the summit, we realized something. Only 3 of us remained. "Where's Ben?" Lauren asked, her voice trembling. We stopped, turning to look down the trail. Ben had been right behind us, complaining about the steep climb. Now there was no sign of him. "Ben!" Jake shouted, his voice echoing. The forest swallowed the sound. Chris scanned the trees, his face pale. "He was just here," he said. "He couldn't have gone far." We called his name again and again, but the only response was the growing wind. No footsteps, no snapped branches. It was as if Ben had vanished into thin air. Lauren clutched my arm. "This place, something's wrong." Jake's face hardened. "He probably wandered off. Let's keep going. He'll find us." None of us believed it, but we followed Jake anyway, climbing the final stretch to the summit. When we reached the top, all thoughts of Ben evaporated. The summit was a barren plateau, surrounded by jagged cliffs that disappeared into the mist below. At its center stood a massive stone altar, its surface etched with strange, twisting symbols. The carvings seemed alive, pulsing faintly with a sickly green light. "What is this?" Chris whispered. Lauren stepped closer, her eyes wide. "Double quotes.do, you hear that?" We strained to listen. At first there was only the wind, but then faint and distant came the sound of whispers. They rose and fell, growing louder, circling us like a current. "They're calling us," Lauren murmured, her voice distant. The whispers grew louder. Chris grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the altar. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight now, but Jake was transfixed. He traced his fingers along the carvings, his expression a mix of awe and fear. "This is incredible," he said. "It's ancient." The wind howled, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. My stomach twisted as the ground beneath us trembled. Without warning, Lauren broke free from Chris and bolted toward the edge of the cliff. "Lauren!" I screamed, but she didn't stop. She turned at the very edge, her face eerily calm. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Then she stepped backward and disappeared into the mist. For a moment, none of us moved. The wind howled, carrying her last words. Jake cursed, breaking the silence. "We have to find her." He ran toward the edge, but Chris yanked him back. "She's gone, Jake. There's nothing we can do." Tears streamed down Jake's face as he stared into the void. "This isn't right," he whispered. The wind shifted, and suddenly everything was quiet. The whispers were gone. "Let's go," Chris said, his voice barely audible. "This place isn't natural." We stumbled back down the trail, but nothing looked familiar. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky. The path split in directions it hadn't before, looping back on itself. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice cracking. But the mountain had other plans. Chris was the next to vanish. One moment he was right behind me, his flashlight cutting through the mist. The next he was gone. No sound, no struggle. Just empty space where he'd been, Chris. I shouted, my voice echoing in the unnatural silence. Jake grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We have to keep moving." The trail led us back to the summit. The altar glowed brighter now, the symbols pulsing in time with my racing heart, and around it stood figures. Ben, Lauren, Chris. They stared at us, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. "They're not real," Jake said, shaking his head. "They can't be real." But the figures stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. Then I saw another figure among them. It was me. The doppelganger stepped forward, its expression blank. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice a hollow echo of my own. Jake screamed, lunging toward the altar, but the ground split beneath him. He fell into the abyss, his screams fading into the void. I stood frozen, the whispers returning, louder and more frantic. The doppelganger reached out, its cold hand pressing against my chest. "You can't leave," it said. The altar's glow consumed me, the world dissolving into darkness. And then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the trailhead. The forest was quiet, the sky clear. For a moment I thought it was over, but when I turned I saw the mountain. And from its summit I heard a voice, "Welcome back. No one escapes Devil's Ridge."